15. The light came in thin and gray that Sunday morning, the way winter light does when it has no warmth left to offer. I stood at the small mirror above the wash basin, my prayer cap in both hands, and I couldn't get my fingers to work right. The straight pins kept slipping. The cotton felt rough against my palm. Downstairs, I could hear his boots, that slow, deliberate sound against the floorboards, and the children's voices layering over each other like water. 6 of them, getting ready for church. I hadn't spoken to him since Thursday night, and somewhere in a house I couldn't see, from this window, the bishop was already awake. My name is Sarah, and this is Amish Aunt, a place where I share the stories I spent years not knowing how to tell. If these stories matter to you, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And I'd like to ask you something in the comments. Has there ever been a word you were afraid to say out loud? I'll be reading everyone. I was 19 when I had my first child, a boy born in March, when the mud was still soft in the fields and the whole world smelled like thaw and wood smoke. I remember the women who came, my mother-in-law, 3 neighbors, my own mother, filling the house with the sound of low voices and the smell of soup and something sweet baking in the back. There was a rightness to it, a completeness that I had been raised to recognize as God's hand. My husband sat with the men outside, and when he came in and held our son for the first time, his eyes went bright in a way I had never seen before. I loved him in that moment. I want to be clear about that. I loved him fully. In my community, children are not a choice you make. They are a blessing you receive, and to prevent a blessing is to refuse God's hand, not just quietly in the privacy of your own heart, but in a way the community can see and measure and judge. The Ordnung, the set of unwritten and written rules that govern every part of Amish life, did not need to spell this out in plain language. It lived instead in smaller places, in the way a woman with many children was spoken of with warm approval, and a woman with few was spoken of with a careful, cautious silence that said more than any words. I had grown up breathing that silence. I knew what it meant. I never questioned it. Not in the beginning. The second child came 16 months after the first. The third, 14 months after that. I want to give you a number that might make this real. By the time I was 25 years old, I had been pregnant or nursing without interruption for nearly 6 years. My body had not been entirely my own since before I was old enough to understand what that meant. And I do not say this with anger. Not yet, not in those years. I say it the way you describe the weather. It was simply what was. The women around me had the same weather. We did not compare notes. We made food, and we worked, and we prayed, and our bodies did what they did, and we thanked God for it. I remember the iron taste, that specific heavy taste in the back of the throat that came in the first weeks of each pregnancy before I had said a word to anyone. By the third time, I recognized it before I recognized anything else, before the tiredness, before any other sign. I would be standing at the stove or bent over the garden, and that taste would arrive, quiet and certain, and something in me would go still, not still like peace, still like the moment before a door swings open, and you are not sure what is on the other side. I would finish what I was doing, fold my hands, pray the right prayer, and then I would tell my husband that evening, and he would thank God, and the wheel would turn again. After the 4th child, my back stopped being a thing that felt normal. I don't mean sharp pain, I mean a low, constant ache that lived just above my hips like a tenant who had decided not to leave. I learned to move around it. You learn to move around many things when moving around them is the only option you are given. I remember once during the 5th pregnancy, standing at the kitchen stove in August heat, and the next thing I was aware of was the wall against my cheek. I had not fainted, exactly. I had simply sat down against the wall without deciding to. My oldest, who was 6 then, stood in the doorway watching me with very wide eyes. I told her I was tired. She nodded like she already knew words like that carried more weight than they said. I worry sometimes, thinking back, about what she was learning in those quiet moments. The 5th pregnancy had a shadow over it that the others had not. The midwife, a practical, careful woman who had delivered half the children in our district, came to check on me more often than usual. She did not explain why, exactly. In our community, you do not always explain things directly, but I saw the way she looked at the hollow under my eyes, the way she asked about my sleep with a little more attention than felt routine. And I understood that something was being watched. My husband prayed over me each night, genuinely, carefully, with real tenderness in his voice. I do not want to leave that out. He was not a cruel man. He prayed for me because he loved me and because he feared God. And in his mind, those two things pointed in exactly the same direction. That was the world he had been given, the same as me. The sixth child came 11 months after the fifth. 11 months. I did not know I was pregnant again until I was already several weeks along. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt with a small paper test from a pharmacy 2 towns over, a trip I had made quietly, telling no one. I knelt there for a long time after the result was clear. The sun was warm on my back. A cabbage moth moved slowly over the bean plants. I did not cry. This is the part I still think about years later, that I did not cry. I had used up something. I did not know yet exactly what it was, but I felt its absence very clearly. The way you feel the absence of something you carried so long you stopped noticing it was there. The sixth birth went well. A girl, healthy, with her father's nose, and a serious expression that made the midwife laugh. I held her in the dim room afterward and looked up at the ceiling and thought, not in anger, not in rebellion, not even in sadness exactly. I cannot do this again. It was the quietest thought I had ever had. It arrived without drama, without ceremony, like a fact that had been waiting patiently for me to be still enough to hear it. I did not tell my husband. I did not tell my mother. I carried it home like a stone in my chest, and I set it down in the center of my life, and I went back to work. What I didn't know yet was that stones don't stay where you put them. Thursday night came 6 weeks after the baby. The older children were in bed. The house had settled into that particular quiet that only comes after a full day of 6 children, a silence that feels earned, heavy, almost physical. The baby was asleep in the cradle at the foot of our bed. My husband reached for me in the dark, the way he always had, the familiar unspoken language of our marriage, and I said not loudly, not with argument, not with any of the words I had rehearsed 100 times in my head and never used. I said, I can't. 2 words, barely a whisper. His hand went still. The room held its breath. He didn't speak. He turned over. And I lay there in the dark, listening to the baby's soft breathing and the distant sound of wind against the plain curtains. And I felt the mattress between us as if it had become something solid, something that had always been there and had only now been named. He was polite in the days that followed, gentle with the children, careful with me, present in all the practical ways a husband is present. But he did not look at me directly, not at breakfast, not in the evening, not when we passed in the narrow hallway. There is a particular quality to being looked past by someone who shares your bed, your table, your prayers. It is not anger exactly. It is something more procedural than anger. It is the feeling of watching someone make a decision about you that they have not yet told you about. I washed dishes and nursed the baby and put the older children through their lessons, and I watched him from the corner of my eye, and I waited for whatever was coming because something was clearly coming, and I had no way to stop it. That was Saturday. On Saturday evening, while I stood at the sink with my back to him, he said 4 words. The bishop wants to speak with us. He said it the way you say something you have been holding carefully, like a cup filled too full. Then he went outside, and I stood there with the dishwater going cold around my hands. I want to tell you about walking into church that Sunday, because I think about it still. The way the morning light fell through the plain windows onto the long benches. The smell of wood and wool and whatever someone had baked that morning still lingering in the cold air. I took my place on the women's side, baby against my shoulder, and I opened my Ausbund, the old hymnal our community has used for centuries, its words worn smooth by generations of hands, and I felt rather than saw 2 or 3 pairs of eyes move toward me and then deliberately away. That deliberate looking away, that is how I knew it had already traveled beyond the bishop. Information in a close community does not wait. It moves the way water moves, finding every small opening, filling every low place, arriving before you do. The bishop's wife served coffee after the service. This is the detail I return to most often, even now. The coffee offered with both hands, warm and ordinary in the middle of what felt to every nerve in my body like a proceeding. The bishop himself was not a harsh man. He spoke quietly, the way men speak when they are certain they do not need to raise their voice. He said there had been word of disharmony in our home, that he had heard I had been unwilling. He did not use the word no. He used the language our community uses for these things, the language of Gelassenheit, of yielding, of a wife's place within God's order. He spoke about what marriage means before God, about the blessing of children, about the danger of a woman placing her own will above her husband's and, by extension, above the church's understanding of God's design. I sat across from him and I listened to my private bedroom become theology. I listened to the quietest, most frightened word I had ever spoken in my life be translated into a problem requiring correction. I held my coffee cup with both hands and I did not spill it. I am still sometimes quietly proud of that. It took me longer than it should have to understand the chain. My husband had not gone directly to the bishop. He had spoken to his father, I believe because he was troubled and did not know what else to do with that trouble, because he had been raised in a world where male elders hold the answers to things a young man cannot solve alone. His father spoke to the deacon. The deacon carried it to the bishop, a chain of 4 men, each one meaning well within his own understanding, each one moving my words further from my mouth and deeper into the community's authority. By the time the bishop spoke them back to me, they no longer belonged to me at all. I do not believe my husband set out to expose me. I believe he did exactly what the system had prepared him to do, and that is the thing I had to sit with longest, because it is harder to be angry at a system than at a person, and harder still to love a person and grieve what the system made him do at the same time. Both things were true. They are still true. I knew a woman, I will call her Mary, who lived in a neighboring district, about 30 minutes by buggy. She had 8 children when I knew her, and before the 8th she had found a way quietly to prevent a 9th. Small pills kept in a jar of dried chamomile in the cellar, hidden behind things no one moved. Her husband found them during a deep cleaning one spring. He did not yell. He went silent for 2 weeks in the way my husband had gone silent, that procedural silence. And then the bishop came. Mary confessed before the full congregation, on her knees in the plain room where she had worshipped her whole life, in front of every face she had ever known. She was placed under a 6-week Beichtgemeinde, a period of church supervision and prayer. She stopped the pills. She had the 8th child. I visited her the week after that birth, and I sat beside her while she nursed the baby, and she looked down at him with real love. I want to be careful here because the love was real, and there was something else beneath the love, something behind her eyes that I recognized without being able to name it yet. I know its name now. It is the look of a woman who has learned exactly how much of herself she is permitted to keep. I was not formally disciplined. The bishop made clear that the door to correction was open if things did not improve, but he did not stand me before the congregation that Sunday. I was given instead the subtler weight, the awareness of being watched, of being a question the community was holding in its collective hands. My mother-in-law began visiting more frequently, with the particular warmth of someone checking on a situation rather than a person. Women at the next quilting frolic were kind to me in a way that had a texture to it, a careful quality like kindness deployed with purpose. And then one morning, about 3 weeks after the bishop's visit, my oldest daughter, she was 12, looked up at me over her breakfast bowl and asked, in a voice so matter-of-fact it nearly undid me, "Ma'am, are you in trouble?" I told her no. I told her everything was fine. She looked at me the way children look at you when they know you are not lying exactly, but you are not telling the whole truth either. She went back to her porridge, and I stood at that stove for a long moment and understood that whatever was being decided here, the cost was not mine alone to carry. There was a night, perhaps a month after all of this, when everyone was asleep and I went out to the porch and sat in the dark with my hands in my lap. The fields were black. The sky was very full of stars in the way it only is when there is no other light for miles. I sat there for a long time, and I made a decision, or the beginning of a decision, or the first true breath toward one that I will not give you all the details of, because some things belong to a person alone, and this one still belongs to me. What I can tell you is this. It was the first time, in as long as I could remember, that I made a choice that did not have to travel through anyone else's hands before it reached me. It was small, it was quiet, but it was mine, and something in my chest, that stone I had carried home from the garden the day I knelt. Dirt shifted. It did not leave, but it moved. If you have ever said something that cost you more than you expected, and found yourself still standing afterward, not free exactly, but different, then you already understand what I am trying to tell you. These stories matter. They deserve to be told carefully and heard carefully. If this is a place you want to return to, I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll carry someone else's story gently, the way I have tried to carry mine. I love my people. I love the sound of the Ausbund rising from 60 voices on a Sunday morning, and the smell of the community kitchen before a wedding, and the way my mother's hands looked folding laundry, quick and certain and peaceful. And that same community reached into my bedroom and took the smallest, most private word I had ever spoken, and made it a matter for men in a room I was barely allowed to speak inside. Both of those things are true. They have always both been true. I am still learning how to hold them at the same time without dropping either one. I hang laundry now on a line behind a house that is quieter than the one I grew up in. My children's voices come through the window while I work, and sometimes I stop and just listen to them for a moment. The ordinary, unremarkable music of it. I do not have a tidy ending for you. I do not think life gives those out, not really. What I have is this, one word, said quietly in the dark, that cost me nearly everything I thought I needed to survive, and gave me back the one thing I had not known I was missing, the knowledge that my voice existed even when no one wanted to hear it, even when I was the last person to believe it. Some words take years to say, but they were always yours.